everyone, do we have a full house? Everyone here that we're expecting? Okay. My name is Sean Caulfield. I am a solicitor and partner at Hodge Jones Null, a local firm to this university. We have an office in Camden, about a 15-minute walk or so from here. And the reason that I come back and do this talk annually is because I was a student at Westminster University quite a long time ago. 2005. So when I say 5, 6, so when I say a long time ago, I really do mean it was quite a long time ago. And quite a few of the trainees and now qualified solicitors, paralegals, various members of staff at Hodge Jones Null have come through Westminster in various different ways. Either done a law degree here, or more particularly, at least one I can think of who was on the legal practice course here last year, and now has a training contract at Alpha. So that's why I come back and give this talk. And as I understand it, you are beginning your journey on the legal practice course, is that right? Yes. So hopefully most of you are thinking about or looking at things like training contracts if you're not going through a different method. And just to reassure you briefly, when I did this course, there was a lot of concern and stress about getting a training contract, and the world's changing, the common exam, that sort of thing, but you, in your particular position, may still require a training contract. From memory, from my particular cohort, everybody who wanted to get a training contract ultimately did. Some people didn't go into law, they used the qualification to advance their career in a different way or into a different profession, but everybody who ultimately stuck at it and wanted to get one did. So if you're concerned about that as the academic year goes on, or you're concerned about it now, make sure that you do have that confidence about you that if you can get yourself through this course, there will be an opportunity for you in the future. Okay? So I'm here primarily to talk to you about advocacy. The lecture will be available to you to listen to or to watch on another occasion. That's why we're recording it. But primarily what I'm going to talk to you about is your ability to communicate on behalf of a client with usually some sort of judge, or to use the generic term, a tribunal. And there is quite a lot of mystery about this, quite a lot of concern that if perhaps English isn't your first language, or perhaps if you're not from a middle class home, or perhaps you're not used to the way that people might speak in court, that this isn't something that comes natural to you. Lots of people will feel that anxiety or will feel that concern about themselves. But what I want you to do is to remember what we're actually trying to achieve when we talk about advocacy. We're talking about communication. That's what it is. So it's not using Latin phrases, or it's not speaking in a particular way. It's communicating to another person. And because you are on this course, I can say with some confidence that all of you obviously can communicate, or you wouldn't have got this far in your educational career. So you can do this, and you do this regularly at home, with friends, with family, with fellow students. You do it with lecturers. You do it all of the time. All you need to do to be a good advocate is that, to focus your mind on what it is you want to communicate and who you want to communicate it to, and tailor what you're saying into that particular part of the profession. So don't start off on the basis that I can't do this, it's not for people like me, I have to get through the course and hopefully find another area of law. You don't want to do advocacy in your later career, that's absolutely fine, it's a perfectly reasonable judgment. But don't tell yourself that you can't do this, because you can and you do all of the time. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about the course itself. There's a lecture today, and then there'll be some small group sessions where you will go through the process of thinking about what you want to say, thinking about how you want to say it, and trying to hone the skills that you will need to present ultimately in firstly a mock and then finally an actual advocacy assessment. So this is separate from the criminal litigation element of this course, but it's in criminal litigation. So what you're going to be communicating about is criminal law. But you're going to be assessed on your ability to communicate it, not just your ability to understand it in the usual academic fashion of doing an exam about criminal law. You're also going to do an assessment in relation to your advocacy, and that will be in January 2026. Now, one of the things that you will, and I will keep mentioning this I think several times, want to do in preparation for this is to make sure that you are aware of what you're good at and what you're not so good at when it comes to being an advocate. So to give you an example, most of us will have a particular habit or trait, body language, that gives away to the listener whether you're nervous or whether you're confident about what you're saying. And not all, but a large part of being an advocate is persuading the person who's listening to you that you believe in what you're saying. So if you're an advocate that looks nervous, you can persuade your judge that even you don't believe in the case. So you need to know what you look like when you're speaking to people, what your particular habits or traits are. So you'll need to record yourself using a mobile device or an iPad, whatever you want to do, and watch yourself back. You won't enjoy it, no one likes doing it. Famous television stars don't like watching themselves on television because it's uncomfortable. And these are the people who are at the very top of British television. They'll say, I don't watch the show, I don't like watching myself. So that's natural. But what you need to do is have the discipline to do it, and then you'll see there'll be a particular trait. So I'll give you an example of my own particular behaviours. I recognised that when I was in court, one of the things I would do is I would move my hands around quite a lot. I would hold my hands, I would move my hands up, and I would move my hands down. And it doesn't really do any harm, I suppose. But where it is a problem is it's distracting the judge from listening to the content of what I'm saying. So I want to make sure that you're from the very beginning aware of the fact that the content of what you are saying is important. And anything that detracts from that, because you turn up to the assessment looking a bit scruffy, you turn up a bit late, you turn up and wave your hands around, or you turn up and in some way behaving in a way that detracts from what's coming out of your mouth, which is the golden content that we want to hear, then you need to know about it before you can do anything about it. Because if you haven't watched yourself, then you might find that come the assessment, the mock assessment, you watch back a video of yourself, which will be part of the process after the mock, and you look at yourself and you think, oh, I do that. I never knew I did that. And you haven't had the chance to iron it out of your particular approach before the mock assessment. And the mock will be the only mock. So you want to get that out of your particular style before the mock and focus on what you're actually saying. Okay? That's a really important thing for you to do. You can do it on your own. With your mobile device, you can buddy up with somebody here, or a friend, or a member of your family, and get them to help you with that, and watch and say, it's really good what you're doing, but you keep twitching your shoulder all the time. You won't know it unless you watch yourself or you work with somebody else. Okay? So when working towards the assessment, do keep in mind that very practical advice. The teaching team that we've got headed up by Dora in relation to advocacy, Dora is available on Tuesdays and Fridays. I think probably if you want to speak to her, it might be just as easy to email her, and then you can have an appointment to see her should you need one. Let's now examine what exactly advocacy is. Okay? So first and foremost, it is an art. And what that means is it's not a science. So for example, if you want to get to the bottom of what's the makeup of penicillin, or you want to get to the bottom of how nuclear fusion works, there is only really one answer, it's scientific. But in our particular area of law that we're talking about tonight, there is some scope for you doing it in the way that you want to do it. There are certain rules, there are certain regulations within which you have to work, but broadly, you're given some discretion to decide how to present the case, what to stress as the most important thing, what to leave out if you feel it is unhelpful. So you have some discretion, but there are rules within which you must work. The other thing to keep in mind is it's pleading the case of another person. So don't confuse winning or losing the case, or having a good case or a bad case, with your own performance. You can have a shockingly difficult case, which is extremely difficult to win, and which you ultimately lose, but you did a really good job. You did everything you possibly could have done, okay? So you're pleading someone else's case, not your own. So you have a professional distance from them. You're not being either emotional or passionate about that particular case. You're being as clear-eyed as you possibly can and putting forward the best possible version of their case, not yours. So you are not judged by the winning or the losing. You are judged by how well you presented a case, which might have been very easy or might have been very hard, but you're judged on how well you did in that context. And it will always, for our purposes, be before a judicial tribunal. And one of the things to keep in mind about a judicial tribunal is in the United Kingdom, and as far as I know in every jurisdiction, the judge is an extremely important position within the court. You don't get to tell the judge what to do or to negotiate with the judge. So you have to show appropriate respect, because if you don't, ultimately you wouldn't pass the assessment, and ultimately you wouldn't be able to practice regularly in a courtroom. So it is before a judge. It's not a informal hearing. It is very much formal. But you're given some scope, as I say, to do it the way you want, pleading this other person's case, but in front of the judge. So you have to make sure that you show the appropriate respect to that judge. Now, these are some of the things we're going to talk about tonight. For each bullet point will have some element of input within these slides, and I'll make sure that we go through them in as much detail as I think we do need to do. We'll talk about what an advocate actually is, what qualities you will need, rights of audience. Are we familiar with rights of audience? Anybody know what that means? Yes? Yeah. Essentially, a qualification if you like to be there. So solicitors have rights of audience automatically to appear in the Magistrates Court, which is the lower of the two main criminal courts. We don't have rights of audience to appear in the Crown Court. You can apply, pass an exam, make the application, and then you can appear in the Crown Court. But you don't have a right of audience there until you've done that. Barristers do. So you need to be aware of that. Then modes of address and formal language. They're not desperately complicated, these modes of address, but you do occasionally see people who get them wrong, so you need to make sure that you're clear on exactly how you're going to address your judge. Historically, in the Magistrates Court was the only area that was a bit complicated because you had Sir and Madam. And for lots of probably quite sensible reasons, in the last 18 months, 12 months or so, they've changed that from Sir and Madam to Judge. So now everyone's referred to as a judge. So it takes that's like the awkward thing if you're not quite sure whether it's Sir or Madam. You can just say Judge. In fact, you should just say Judge. If you choose to say Sir or Madam, I don't think that's going to be a huge issue because lots of the older advocates in court still say Sir and Madam, and the newer, younger ones are more familiar with the term Judge. But Judge is the correct term now in the Magistrates Court. In the High Courts, we'll talk about this. It's not gendered, it's just Your Honour. Well, actually, when you get to the High Courts, it's My Lord or My Lady. What I do want you to be aware of is who you are appearing in front of. So there have been episodes, for example, in the past on this course, where people have been queuing up to do their mock or even their actual assessment at Dora's door, and they're expecting to get Dora. But at the last minute, the people are going very quickly or very slowly, or someone calls in sick, things change, and then they are diverted to someone else's courtroom, who may not necessarily be a female judge. So if you've written down and you've got stuck in your mind that the first thing you're going to say is good morning, madam, you're going to get off to quite a bad start if actually it's a male judge. So you've got to make sure that you are looking at your judge when you're talking to your judge, and you're getting feedback from them about whether you're going in the right direction or you're going in the wrong direction, and listen to that feedback. If the judge says to you, I agree, you don't need to make the next 7 points on the same issue if the judge is agreeing with you. So listen to your judge, react to your judge, and make sure that you're aware of the feedback you're getting. Okay? We'll give you some advice for new advocates, what you might be called upon to do, the sort of do's and don'ts, if you like, of being an advocate, things to look out for. Ethics, not a huge amount of ethics in advocacy because you're being policed all the time, if you like, by your judge, so it's difficult to go too far wrong. But keep in mind that, as a general rule of thumb, if an advocate tells a judge that something is factually correct, for example, I've called his mum and his mum said he can stay there, the judge is going to assume, quite correctly, that you have called that person's mother, and that call did involve the mother saying, yes, he can stay at my house. They're taking you as, the correct term is an officer of the court, that's what the term they use. What the judge means by that is they're trusting you. So you do not want to find yourself in a situation where you breach that trust in some way and you represent something or suggest something that's not actually accurate. So making a mistake is not a huge problem for the purpose of advocacy. Not ideal, but we can live with it. But saying something that's not right, that's incorrect, is quite serious. And we'll give you an example of that when we talk through the ethics element. And then we'll talk a little bit about preparation, because like most people, you're very interested in the high-fluting issues at the High Court, but what you really want to know is, how do I pass the assessment? And like everybody else. So we'll talk a bit about that, and we'll talk about whether it will be a bail application or a plea litigation, meaning, is it A, a bail application, someone who's in custody, in prison, waiting for their trial who wants to be released, or is it B, a plea litigation, which is someone who's about to be sentenced, and you're putting forward reasons why the judge should sentence them less harshly, more leniently, than would otherwise be the case, and give you some flavour of the assessment criteria, so you know what you should be working towards and what you should be hoping to achieve. Okay? So we're going to go through those now. Any questions on that before we dive into it a little bit more? Yes?
Will it always be a district judge or could it be a judge?
In this establishment, it will all be a district judge. Yes, so you'll always have either judge, sir, or madam. So whoever your worships. So let's have a look now what an advocate does. So your primary task will be to present the case and to persuade a judge to do something that they wouldn't otherwise have done. So to give you an example of the sorts of things we're talking about, a client will occasionally come to your office, particularly if they're funded by legal aid and they're being, let's say, evicted from their house, if it's a housing case, or they're falsely accused of something if it's a criminal case, and they'll have, and this does happen, a large shopping bag of papers that are strewn all inside the bag, coffee stains and no pagination or pages, no idea what document goes where or even what they are, and they'll just throw it on your desk and they'll say, this proves I'm innocent, or this shows I shouldn't be evicted from my house. Part of your job as the advocate, not just the litigator, but as the advocate, is to present that to the judge, and to present it in a physical form if necessary, and to be able to lead the judge through the individual elements that are important, to get rid of the stuff that may have no importance whatsoever, and to get the judge to focus on the important issues. So another example of presentation is CCTV footage is often quite important, particularly in criminal cases. There's more and more CCTV cameras, ring doorbells, police officers' body-worn footage, so a lot of things are now captured on some sort of recording, visual recording. And it's probably more common that there is a part of the case that's a visual recording than not. So you'll usually have at least one thing that's recorded. So I had a case a few years ago where police officers chased this guy into an office because he was being quite rude, the truth, and unpleasant to them and swearing at them. So they eventually said, we're going to arrest you for a public order offence. He ran away, they ran after him, they chased him into the office, nothing to do with him, the office was in his office. He ran around the office, and then they were chasing him back out of the office because they couldn't catch him, and then they all ended up falling over. And they said, that he pushed one of them over and that he assaulted them by pushing over. He was so reckless that eventually he pushed one of them over and that he was responsible for the assault. But in preparing the case and presenting it, we were able to slow down the footage and read out the times when the individual officers were chasing him and show that what really happened was as he ran out of the office, a police officer stood in front of him and tripped him up. And then he went over the first officer, landed on the second officer, and he did hurt him, but the reason he hurt him was the first officer had tripped him up. But we were able to present the case by slowing down the footage, pointing out the officer who was raising his arm, pointing out the officer who was raising his leg, showing the body falling. And by the time we'd finished, it was fairly obvious that what actually happened was the officers tried to trip him up and inadvertently cause him to fall onto their colleagues and injure them. And that is an example of how an advocate will present the case, because you question the police officers while showing them the footage and asking them what's happening and take them through the individual stills or moments when they are doing something that they probably shouldn't have been doing. And then once you've done that, you've presented the case, hopefully then you can use the new interpretation of the material, whether it's a written document, whether it's footage, to persuade the court that what they might have thought was happening wasn't actually what was happening, and at the very least it's possible something else was happening, or indeed it's probable that something else was happening. So in that particular case, we reached a stage in the case where the judge said to the prosecution lawyer, I think we've seen enough, perhaps it's time for you to essentially drop the case and offer no evidence. So we didn't even complete the case. The footage was so clear in the end, once it was presented, that the prosecution conceded the fee to go through the trial and surrendered in town. That won't always happen because sometimes, believe it or not, the police haven't actually done anything wrong, and the person is responsible for doing something wrong. But your job is to present it in the best way that you can with the documents or the footage or the forensic material that you've got available to you as the advocate, and then do your best to persuade the judge to do something that he or she may not have thought about doing until they heard your interpretation of the evidence and you presenting the case based on your, hopefully, careful preparation. Okay? So, if tomorrow you decide that you are going to go down to the Old Bailey and you're going to go to the public gallery and you're going to watch one of these incredibly skilled King's Counsels who are there and she's cross-examining a witness in a murder case and you think, God, she's so good, she's brilliant, how does she do all this? And she's getting to look at forensic material and CCTV and firearms officers and she's peppering them with questions and making everyone else look like a fool. You could think, very easily, that you'll never be as good as that and that she was just born with this kind of magic skill. But what she's actually done, while we've been here enjoying ourselves with this wonderful talk, is probably sitting in a small room of her house with her laptop, going through the footage really carefully, reading the documents really carefully, making notes, preparing, and when she turns up tomorrow, it looks like it just suddenly occurred to her. Why don't we have a look at page 322, paragraph 3. How did she know that? How did she do that? Well, she did it because she worked really, really hard. She read all of the case papers, she went through all the 321 pages that came first, then on to the next one, then it read it through and spotted a really good point finally. So it doesn't happen by accident if you see a good advocate. It happens because they've done the preparation, they've looked at the evidence. And you need to take from that that's what you need to do for your assessment. Some of you will be, for want of a more sophisticated phrase, very happy to talk all day. Some people can't. We've all got friends who think, well, they never stop talking. That might be you. Or you might be one of the shy ones who doesn't really want to talk too much. Both of those skills have their own importance when it comes to advocacy, but neither of those people will succeed if they haven't prepared. So being able to speak at great length is only so useful. I'll tell you, as you may not know, it's limited to 8 minutes. So it's not about how much you can speak, it's about the content of what you will say in those 8 minutes. And if you've prepared well, and if you have done all the work you need to do, and it may be a huge amount of work, because it's not a huge case, but if you've prepared well with the material you've got, you'll be able to deal with the advocacy assessment relatively easily, whether you like talking or you don't like talking. So the presentation and persuasion are what you're doing, but you'll be good at it if you prepared well, and you won't be so good at it if you haven't prepared well. That's going to be the key issue for all of you. Preparation. Prepare well, you'll do well. Don't prepare well, I'll find it more difficult. So you have to know your case, and you have to know the law. These are the sorts of skills that are secondary to that. Once you've prepared well, what we're looking for are oral skills of presentation and persuasion. So you will be, potentially at least, presenting reasons why your client will be a good candidate to be released on bail, and persuading the judge that if he or she releases your client on bail, assuming it's a bail application, that they're not a risk to the public to commit another crime, or they're not a risk that they'll interfere with a witness and go around and bang on their door, or they're not a risk that they'll run off. And you will try and persuade through argument the judge that those risks are not particularly big, if they even exist at all. And they're not particularly big because, for example, you can exclude him from the shopping market and say he can't go in there. Or you can say that he can't go out after 9 o'clock if it's a nighttime offence. And the judge can impose conditions upon him based on what the judge thinks is appropriate and also based on what you suggest to the judge. So you can persuade the judge that the risks are not so great. But to do this, you have to have prepared well so you know what's persuasive and what's not. So to give you an example of somewhere where I went wrong, many years ago I said to a judge, probably not as many as I would like it to be, but a while ago, I said to a judge, this man hasn't committed any offences since 2022, which I thought was great. He's not been in trouble for 4 years. The judge looked at the file and then said, that's because he was convicted of a really serious crime in 2022 and he's been in prison for 3.5 years. So it was kind of hard for him to do anything wrong. I hadn't looked at all of the list of previous convictions. I just saw they ended in 2022. I didn't see why. They ended because he was in prison. If you don't prepare, you don't do well, as I say, and I apply that to myself. So that's the sort of thing that you'll be expected to do. Now, in terms of the detail of what you will be preparing, what you're looking at is preparing the relevant facts. So, to give you an example of a relevant fact, if in the case your client comes out of his house and turns left, that might be quite important. If your client's wearing a blue jacket, that might be quite important. If you read the facts and know them, if someone says to you during the course of the bail application, the judge says, well, he came out and he turned right, you can say, well, judge, actually, if you look at the statement, it says he turned left, or he had a blue jacket or not a red jacket. You need to know those facts well enough that if something is said during the course of the bail application, you are able to confirm if it's correct, or indeed dispute it if it's not. And you will be asked questions by the judge, because that's how it works in court. If you say, for example, Mr. Jones is not going to be a risk to the public to commit further offences, the judge may say to you, well, you say that, but I noticed he was on bail in 2018 for a serious crime, and while he was on bail he committed another offence. What makes you think in 2026 he won't do it again if he did it in 2018? It's quite a difficult question to answer, because there's not actually a complete answer. But if you know the facts, if you know your case, there might be something in his statement that says, in 2018 I was on drugs, but now I'm married, I'm clean of drugs, I'm working. There might be information in there. If you're prepared, you can deploy it when the judge questions you on that. So you must know the facts of your case. Then there's the substantive law and the procedural law. Anybody wants to take a hazard at a guess of what substantive law might be? Yes? Exactly that, yeah. So imagine someone accused of theft. The substantive law is the Theft Act of 1967. And if it's a bail application, you would look at the, for example, criminal procedure rules around bail applications and the Bail Act of 1976. That might sound a bit intimidating straight off the bat, but remember, you'll be given your case papers several weeks in advance. So if it's a theft, you can go and look at the Theft Act. If it's a bail act, you can look at the bail act in advance and see what the procedure is. But you want to make sure that you have done that, that you've looked at what a theft is. So if you haven't understood that, you may make a point in your bail application that's not correct. You've got the law wrong. So you've got to look at that in advance of the hearing and make sure you've understood it. Most of the substantive law is not complicated, it's simple, but you have to read it to make sure you're satisfied that the crime that he's accused of is actually made out. Is it correct, if it were true? And then finally, there's a thing called an advocacy plan. Now, an advocacy plan has two different purposes, and I'll tell you the one that's important to this institution first, and I'll tell you the one that's important to me as a professional and to you as a professional in the future second. When you do particularly your final assessment, the examiner will want you to hand in your advocacy plan, which will be a note of the preparation that you've done for this assessment. Not pages and pages, but perhaps maybe a page, maybe two, I think three is probably going too far, but just notes of what it is you want to say, so that we can see the preparation you've done. It's a little bit, the analogy isn't quite correct, but it's a little bit like looking at someone's maths homework or solicitor's accounts. If you've got the sum wrong at the end, you've got the answer wrong at the end, in theory, you're just wrong, you get no marks, bad luck. If you're one digit out, and your examiner can go, well, I can see what she did here, and got it right, and then at the very last time, she times by 1, not by 10. So she just made a silly mistake, I'm going to give her 50% of the marks, because clearly she knows what she's doing, but got a bit panicked and didn't times by 10, she times by 1. See you working out, you get good marks, even though you're technically wrong with your answer. The advocacy plan here has a similar role. We can see if you're thinking about the right issues, if you're preparing about the right facts, and then if you get a bit flustered in the actual assessment, obviously that's not ideal, but if we can see on the advocacy plan that you were going in the right direction all along, it helps us understand that you're in the right area. So that's what it's for here. Now, in the assessment, and also in actual criminal courts, the reason that you might want an advocacy plan is because when you are standing up and responsible for asking questions or for raising points, it can cause a certain amount of nervousness, which you may or may not know. Some of you may be nervous already, even though the assessment isn't until January, for example. And when you stand up in a courtroom or you stand up in your assessment, you will sometimes find that you start to feel a little bit unwell, and that you start to think it's very warm in the room. And depending on your skin tone, if you're like me, you start to redden slightly, and you start to look like someone who is really nervous. And then if you look down at your witness statements, charge sheet, if you look down at the previous convictions, if you look down at any of the documents that you've got in front of you, you will find that it's very, very hard to read those documents when you're under that sort of pressure. And what will tend to happen is that as you look at a detailed witness statement with lots of text on it, the lines do this slightly magical and bizarre thing of looking back at you and then starting to move around and up and down, and you can't focus on any of it. And it's some sort of weird magic. And what's happening is your nerves are getting the better of you, and you can't focus and look down and find the exact point you would have found the night before when you were home in your bedroom. So what you need is short, clear bullet points that will bring you back to life and make you think, ah, yes, his home address, or curfew, keeping him out of the local area. And those bullet points will be within your advocacy plan. They are not written out streams of sentences and paragraphs. They are bullet points to prompt you when you have, and some of you will have, that moment when you just lose focus. Judge asks you a question, you try and answer it, you do quite well, you think, oh God, yeah, I got through that. And then the judge says, please continue. And you think, what was I saying? What on earth was I talking about? If you have an advocacy plan, you will look down and you will remember, that's the bullet point I dealt with last, lots of space underneath it, next bullet point, move on. If you don't have that, there is a genuine danger that you'll start to panic. And once you start to panic, it spreads, okay? It'll affect you in terms of your memory, affect you in terms of how you look, and you'll start to get very, very warm indeed. If you have a plan, you should look down the plan and you think, I knew this was going to happen, which is why I got my plan, and I just go on to my next point, and everything is very calm. I'm not suggesting this is what you do, but I'm going to share with you the advocacy plan that was given to me when I first started in court. Many years ago, when I was a bit younger, there was a woman who lived in South London who was a solicitor, and she used to do a lot of work for our firm. But to save her having to come all the way into our office in North London, I would bring the files home with me in the evening, because everything was paper, that's all gone now, everything's digital obviously, and I would hand the files over to her. And I got to know her quite well. She'd come every night, I'd hand over the files, she'd come the next day, return to me, and I'd take them back to the office. And then when I finally qualified, I still brought files home for her, and I gave her the files, and as she was going out the gate, we never really had much of a conversation. She was leaving straight away to go back about her business. I said, I'm in court tomorrow. She went, oh great. And what I meant was, help me, help me. And I said, well, I'm quite nervous about my first day. She went, oh, I'm sure it'll be fine. And I had to really beg her, any tips? She went, what are you doing? I said, I'm doing a plea investigation. And she said, fine, you've got a bit of paper. And I said, yeah, she's got a pen. I've got a pen. And she wrote down, offender, offence, sentence. Give me that piece of paper and said, use that. That'll do. That's all she gave me. And I have been using that advocacy plan for the last 20 years. Because everything you need to say about someone who's being sentenced is either about them, the offender, so I talk about how old he is, whether he's got any addiction issues, is he married, is he single, does he have any special educational needs, is he neurodiverse, does he have any diseases, any addictions, anything I want to say about him. And then I'm finished with him. Then I move on to talk about the offence. He was stealing a chicken, but before he stole the chicken, he was stopped, the chicken was returned, and the supermarket didn't suffer any loss and was resold, so no money was lost by the supermarket. That's the offence. Then I go on to talk about the sentence. He pleaded guilty, we'll give him a discount for pleading guilty. He hasn't done anything like this before, so he has no previous convictions. He could be available for a community order, he can do unpaid work, he's fit and he's well, and he's willing to do any unpaid work. That's a sentence. So those three headings will still appear if I've got a notebook or if it's now a laptop when I am about to mitigate for somebody. It's as simple as that, for me at least. You may choose to have a more complicated version. It doesn't have to be simple or complicated, but it has to be short, okay? So that when you look down, you don't have that panic, you have a calmness about you, because you know your case, you've mastered your facts, and you have a plan in front of you that you can look down and see a clear bullet point that says something like health conditions, or something like health issues. And you know enough about your case to talk for a minute or two about that particular part of the case. If you write it all out, everything you want to say like a script, you will suffer the same curse of nerves and difficulty reading it out. To say the obvious, it's not a reading test. All of you are on a postgraduate course. You can, of course, read very well. No one's testing that. What we're testing is your ability to look someone in the eye and explain why someone should be released on bail, explain why someone should have a shorter sentence, explain why someone is not guilty of a particular crime. So it's a different sort of test. One that you are more than capable of completing because you do it all the time in your life. But make sure you understand that when you are preparing your advocacy plan. Okay? Any questions on that? Good. Now, rights of audience. These are the respective courts that you will potentially appear in if you wish to do so. Lots of solicitors never appear in court, and given the opportunity to do so, never would. but lots of solicitors do appear in front of these particular tribunals. The Magistrates' Court and the tribunals are the ones that solicitors have rights of audience to appear in front of, and for some of the others, depending on the Coroner's Court and the individual court involved, you may have to apply for higher rights. If you wish to do that, I would say that you consider that at the time you are doing your training contract, which for some of you may not be that far away. If you're not worried about it, don't bother. But if it's something you want to do, keep it in mind all the way through your career. Take opportunities to get the training and get the qualification. Okay? There was, quite a while ago, a huge rush of solicitors to obtain a higher rights and appear, particularly in the Crown Court. But there was a realisation over time that it's really quite hard, and less people are doing it now than historically were doing it. And the fees are not particularly attractive either. And so it's quite hard to be both profitable and have a work-life balance. But lots of people are still doing it. Should you be interested, as I say, then the rights of audience regulations are here. And you can look into that as and when you get to that stage in your career. But do it while you're doing a training contract if that's what you choose to do. Okay? Now, let's have a look at the modes of address. These are the ways that you refer to your particular judge. You will see here that the Sir and Madam has gone completely from this category. So district judges of the High Court, County Court, Magistrates Court are now only referred to as judge. And assuming that you haven't been appearing in the Magistrates Court already, which seems probably unlikely, but I think possible, you won't have got into that habit. So just refer to your judge as judge. In the other courts, you will see there's a whole series of different terms. In the Crown Court, you will refer to the judge as Your Honour, so it's not gendered. But in the High Court, it is my lord or my lady, so it is still gendered. These are not going to trouble you because you're not going to have any assessments based on High Court or Crown Court appearances, so you don't need to worry about them. But you might choose to be familiar with them. Okay, it's not on there, but in the Chancery Division of the High Court, I think they might even change it now. You didn't refer to the judge then as Sir or Madam. You had to call the judge Master, which probably gives you an idea how old the legal profession is in England and Wales. But you would genuinely refer to another professional, albeit a judge, not just by Sir or Madam, but you would call them Master. That was the term that was used. That has recently gone, and now they are also judge. If you're referring to your opponent, it is important that you give them enough respect. If they're a barrister, you say my learned friend, and if it's a solicitor, you just say my friend. You may not necessarily think they are particularly friendly. You may not even like them. But if you refer to somebody like that, that's a neutral phrase. If you are rude about another professional, just to be clear, it reflects on you, not on them. You might be right, you might even be furious with your opponent, but if you behave in a way in court that shows them a lack of respect, then that is only ever going to appear as if you are the one who's in the wrong. So at all times, make sure that you retain good manners and you refer to your judge appropriately and your opponent appropriately. In your assessment, there will be no other opponent there, but you might make reference to the prosecution said, my friend from the prosecution said in their particular case. That will have happened before you start your assessment. So the assessment involves the assumption that the prosecution lawyer has been on his or her feet, has already addressed the judge, and said all the things they want to say, made all the points they want to say, sat down, and then you stood up. And that's the point the assessment starts. None of the prosecution submissions are actually going to happen. The assessment is that they have happened before you have your turn, because that's how it works in the criminal courts. Okay? And just briefly, there was a question earlier on about whether the assessment would have judges or lay magistrates. This is a terminology for lay magistrates. We won't be having them in our assessment, but they would be referred to as Sir or Madam individually if you spoke to one, and if you speak to them collectively, you say your worships when you are referring to all of them. It's only occasionally I realise how ridiculous that sounds, because I'm so used to saying it, to refer to a group of people as your worships does sound a little bit odd, but that is the correct term. They won't be in your assessment, so that is only for your information. Any questions? Okay, formal language. This is the sort of language that you should be thinking about, I'm not saying using intentionally, but thinking about when you are appearing in court. It is not the case that this is the sort of language you have to use, or indeed that you should use. Some of these phrases I think are quite useful. If you have a leading case on a particular point of law that you say supports your version of what the law is, you could say something like, Judge, if I might refer you to the case of. That's a perfectly good way of doing it, but it's not the only way to do it. You can say it in a whole load of different ways. That's entirely up to you. But that is one way of dealing with it. What I'm interested in for your purposes is this particular reference. Does Your Honour have a copy of the defendant's antecedents? Does anybody know what the lawyer will be referring to when he talks about the defendant's antecedents? Previous convictions. Okay. So from this room, it might be that most of you knew that, but only I think 2 or 3 of you said the answer. So I'm guessing some of you wouldn't have known that. My view is if the defendant who you're acting for doesn't know what antecedents are, then if your job is to represent that person, probably don't call them antecedents, call them his previous convictions. You sound much more professional if you say antecedents, and indeed you can probably charge a higher rate if you're talking about antecedents rather than previous convictions, because it sounds more mysterious and important, and you should be paid more for looking at antecedents than you should for looking at previous convictions. But to give you a real-life example of what concerns me about that sort of phrase, is I was in court, a very similar remark made by the prosecutor. This was in the days of paper, again, so that's how long I've been in practice. And the prosecutor said, I'll hand up the defendant's antecedents, because that's how we talked. Hand them, you don't pass them up, you hand them up. And there was a knock from behind me, and I turned around and the defendant doing this. So I asked the judge, because you have to, may I turn my back, which is a ridiculous phrase, but we have to say that. May I turn my back? The judge said, of course. I go over to the dock, and I say to the defendant in the dock, what's wrong? And he said to me, he wants my antecedents to be handed up to him. I said, yeah, no, I heard. What are my antecedents? And how do you hand them up? And I thought, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. You're not an idiot. That's a sensible question. Why are we talking about antecedents? The case is about you, and you don't know what we're talking about. So I went back and I said to the judge, the defendant wants to know exactly what we're talking about, and as I understand it, Your Honour, what we're talking about is the prosecutor giving you a copy of his previous criminal history. The judge said, quite right, yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. Sorry, Mr. Jones. And it said, Mr. Jones, I apologise. We're using terminology that's quite old-fashioned, and if you don't know what we're talking about, then frankly, we're all doing it wrong. Because you have to know what we're talking about. So you can say that, and you will sound smarter, but I'm not sure you actually are smart, you just sound smarter. So you can use it if you want to, but my real point is, don't get carried away with this sort of terminology. This isn't the right way to do it. It's just the way that we've often done it. I'm not quite sure it's the best way, but it's one way. You can just talk in ordinary, simple language. This is a little bit better for me. My lady, if I may deal with the points your ladyship has raised, just a way of saying to the judge, I've heard what you've said, and now I'm going to try and answer those questions. And this particular one I do like, because it's a very helpful sort of oral full stop, if you like. So what happens when you're finished making your point to the judge is you're not supposed to sit down in the presence of the judge unless the judge is no longer talking to you, and the judge is talking to your opponent, or talking to the defendant. So you sort of stand there staring at the judge. Now the judge may not know that you finished. So most judges are quite polite and will wait for you to finish saying what you're saying. So then you find yourself in a bit of a standoff. You're looking at the judge is looking at you, and no one's saying anything. Just this really awkward silence. And the judge thinks, has he finished? And you think, isn't she going to say anything? And you're stuck for a really awkward 5-10 seconds. If you say something like, not necessarily this, but something like this, unless I can be of any further assistance, that concludes my submissions. It's a really nice way of saying to the judge, I'm done. Any questions? Which you wouldn't say, but you might say something a little bit more formal like, that concludes all the points I want to make, Your Honour, or whatever it happens to be. So that sort of thing is useful. Because once you've had a few of those moments where you're stood there in that awkward silence, you realise you need something just to finish it off and to say to the judge, I'm done. Okay? So some of this formal language can be useful. But my broader point is pick the bits you like and you're comfortable with and you think work. Don't just think, I've got to speak like that, because you don't. Okay? Now, advice for the new advocate. So first and foremost, know and assist your tribunal. So you need to make sure that you are aware of anything about your particular judge or your particular tribunal that is unusual or important. If they've got a particular interest in something, that's not always easy to do, especially here. But to give you an example, there's a judge I can think of at Hybrid Court and Magistrates Court. When you're sitting in his court, he has a particular thing about filling in the case management form in a very detailed fashion. For lots of reasons, we've become really quite slack at filling in these case management forms because everyone's busy and you want to get your case called on quickly and get away. So people don't fill it in as carefully as they would normally do if they were held to a high standard. This judge has a very, very high standard. He wants every single box ticked, including things like, do you want to get your case papers in Welsh? No one ticks that in Camden, because no one wants their case papers in Welsh. But he will stop the courtroom and he will say, you haven't said yes or no about Welsh. And you feel like saying, well, it's no, obviously. No one here speaks Welsh. Or if they do, they also speak English. But in his court, if you know him, you tick, no, I don't want my case papers in Welsh, because you know him. So if you have a judge who has a particular issue or a particular desire things to be done particularly quickly, particularly well, then you listen to that judge and you take it on board. When I first appeared at the same courtroom many years ago, I appeared for a judge who is long retired, called District Judge Quick. And I had prepared an absolute massive amount of litigation. I had pages of it. And when I stood up in court, I spread it all out on the desk in front of me. And I was prepared to give the judge a huge amount of information. Now, this judge was a very experienced judge, and as I learned many years later, was a smoker. And what she wanted to do, I realised afterwards, was to go outside for a cigarette. And she saw me with all these papers here and about to launch into this massive speech, and she thought to herself, I'm not having this. I'm not going to be here for 25 minutes while he goes on and on. So she said to me, I've read the pre-sentence report. They say I shouldn't send him to prison, and I should give him a suspended sentence. Is that what you're going to ask me to do? And I said, yes. And she said, that's what I'm doing. Thank you. Court rise. And she was gone. I said, but hold on, I've got the judge. I said, judge. Or madam, I would have said madam. And she said, if you want, I can send him to prison, but I'm quite happy to give him a suspended sentence unless you want to change my mind. No, thank you. You've got to listen. If she says that's what she's doing and that's what you wanted, the case isn't about you talking for 25 minutes. It's about getting ideally what you want. So if she's going to give you that and leave, that's fine. Take that. Listen to what she wants to do, and if it's what you wanted her to do, you've won. If they push you in a particular direction to say, I'm worried about whether you can commit further offences. If you then say, well, if I can address you about the risk of him contacting the witness, the judge is going to say to you, I just asked you to talk about whether he might commit further offences. So you've got to listen to your judge and react to what the judge says. Okay? In your assessment, as in real life, there will be questions. Okay? You have to prepare for the very real experience of having someone, the judge, interrupt you mid-flow and say, yes, that's all very interesting, but actually, that's not important. What I want you to talk about is this. I want to ask you about that. Be prepared for that. If you've got an advocacy plan, when that happens, you can either jump a bullet point if it's not relevant, or come back to what you were saying if you feel it is relevant, once you've answered the question. But you've got to be prepared for that. And that should include what I said much earlier on about, it's not your case. It's not a personal slight at you. It's not an attack on your character. It's not suggesting that you're not doing well. It's the judge saying, this is what I want to be told about. This is what I'm interested in. And as a professional, I'm asking you to tell me. So it's not undermining you or putting you down or making you feel small. That's not the purpose of the judge. But that can happen. You can feel that emotion. But remember, you're going to have to tell yourself, I knew there were questions coming, and this is one of them. And as part of that, the preparation includes you thinking to yourself in the days and weeks before the assessment, what would I ask? What sort of questions would I ask? Would I ask about the risk of interfering with witnesses? Would I ask about the previous convictions? Would I ask about the danger of him running away? Think about the questions that you think are important, because those are likely to be the same questions the judge will ask. Okay? So in your preparation for what you want to say, think about the sorts of questions that will be coming your way. And if you're very thoughtful, you might find that you've thought of the question in advance and the best answer available. Some of the questions won't have an absolute answer or will be really difficult to answer. You're being judged not on whether there is a magical answer that you come up with that no one's ever thought of. Sometimes you're being judged on how do you react, respond, and deal with a question where there is no answer. You can't answer it, you can't satisfy the judge because there won't be an answer. How do you deal with that is a part of the assessment. So don't struggle too much with the right answer, just think about the best answer that you can possibly come up with. Next point, structure submissions in a logical sequence. When you're preparing particularly your advocacy plan, and also the other documents that you might choose to, don't have to, but choose to prepare, make sure that you're doing things in a logical order. So for example, don't say, he suffers from cirrhosis of the liver, and he only stole one of the chickens, not two. His mother's recently got another job. He was in prison last year, but he says he won't do it again, and he's pleaded guilty. Because that's a jumble of information. All of those points are important in their different ways, but you've got to put them in the place where they go, so that they resonate and stick in the judge's mind. So think of a logical sequence. Not hugely important, exactly what sequence you put them in, but ideally with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and put the things together in the same place. You want to really end talking about sentence, because if it's a sentence, or bail conditions if it's a bail application. So there are certain things that obviously come at the end, but you want to make sure that it's as logical as you possibly can make it. Okay? If you have a good point, and there's a good point in almost every single case, even the worst ones, there's something that is positive, make sure that's the very last thing that you say before you sit down. Or if you've said it already, you repeat it. Because you want the best point in the judge's mind when the judge comes to consider the appropriate punishment or decision on bail. Okay? There is some research on this in terms of the judicial decision. And the two things that they've discovered across various different jurisdictions are, firstly, if a judge is sentencing people, they do some research where they roll the dice with the judge in the voting room before the judge comes out. And let's say they roll the dice and the number comes up as 6, or 4, or 3. Let's call it 3. They then find that the judge's punishment sentence that they're going to impose, whether it's a fine, whether it's a prison sentence, whether it's hours of unpaid work, whatever it is, that the number of months or weeks in prison, the number of pounds that you're fined, the number of hours that you're required to do, gravitates much closer to 3. than to the number that would otherwise have been, because of the power of suggestion, because they rolled a 6 in an experiment. So just rolling a dice in an experiment in a room before the judge comes in moves the judge's thinking towards that number. Some sort of psychology behind that, not really something we want to worry about in this course too much. But what it means, if you end on your best point, the same principle applies. The last thing in the judge's mind before he or she decides on sentence is your best point. So if you've got a really bad point, you want to get that out of the way early on. You're going to have to talk about it because you can't just pretend it doesn't exist. But you don't want that to be the last thing. You want that to be earlier on in your particular submissions. And just briefly, the other point, in terms of ending on your best point, isn't quite so relevant, but the other bit of research they did was they discovered there is a particular time of day across jurisdictions that's the worst time of day to be sentenced for a criminal offence across the world. What time of day, obviously time zones change, but what's the worst time of day do you think locally for you to receive a sentence, a punishment? Just before lunch. So if your case is getting called on at 10 to 12, 5 to 12, you might say to the judge, something's just come up, I'll come back at 2 when you've eaten. Because that's the thing. Judges are, and the point I make really is, judges are human. They get hungry, they get bored, they want a cigarette, like my earlier story. They're normal human people. And if you annoy them by making them miss their lunch, make them stay late, if you drag things out too much, they will take against you to some extent. So make sure you keep in mind you're dealing with a human being. So I used to often wonder when I was at Westminster Magistrates Court why it was that after a while of addressing the judge, his eye would seem to sort of just go up slightly above my head. And he was looking from behind me. I didn't know what it was. It was only when I was finished I realised what it was. There was a clock behind me. And he's obviously thinking, how much longer is this going to go on for? It's a natural human emotion, you know. And you don't want to have to deal with something that's boring or long or tedious. You want to eat, you want to smoke if you're a smoker, whatever it happens to be. If you keep that in mind when you're addressing your judge, it will help you from falling into those pitfalls. You know, they are human, just like the rest of us, or at least most of them are. Next point, courteous, okay? At all times remain courteous when you're talking about people, particularly your client. But if you were, for example, to say, all those police officers are scumbags down at Peckham Police Station, that's going to reflect on you. It's not evidence of the police officers being scumbags, it's you being discourteous. And it will only look bad on you, not on anybody else. So if you don't like somebody and you really don't feel that they're doing their job properly, there may be all sorts of ways to deal with it, but it's not while you're on your feet talking to the judge. Okay? And maintaining eye contact. This is a particular important issue as far as I'm concerned. Again, lots of research on this. If you're talking to someone, and you will recognise this in your normal life, you will usually look at them in the eye. If you're talking to someone and you're looking over there, and they're over there, it's really odd. In court, people don't do it enough. They don't look at the judge. So even though it's a bit intimidating, it's a bit unnerving to look them in the eye, you've got to make sure that you look at them when you address them, okay? And just to give you a very short anecdote about the importance of that, this is well before your time, but many, many years ago, there was what turned out to be a massive social experiment in this. And it was a debate that we had in the UK involving 3 candidates to be Prime Minister. This was back in, I don't even know what year it was, but it was Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, David Cameron was trying to become Prime Minister, and Nick Clegg was the Liberal Democrat candidate to be Prime Minister. And they all appeared on a TV show, as they always do in the modern world, and had a debate. And the first 2, Gordon Brown and David Cameron, after the debate, their polling didn't really move, but Nick Clegg's polling in the Nation after the debate rocketed. It went absolutely through the roof. And at first, no one knew why, because what he said was the same thing that was in his manifesto he'd been saying for 3 or 4 years, and no one could work out what's he done that means that people around the country are saying, I like that guy, I like the guy at the back. And then only as the evening wore on after the debate, and all the journalists and politicians started watching it again, thinking, what did he do? That all of a sudden people are all saying they want to vote for him. What he did was simple. The host would ask a question, and the other 2, instead of looking into the camera and addressing the British people, the hard-working British people, as they would say, turned to the host and said, we won't put taxes up. And the other one would say, we won't put taxes up either. Nick Clegg looked into the camera and said, we won't put taxes up. He looked at the viewer. He didn't look at the audience, and he didn't look at the host in the studio. He looked into the camera. So all of the people watching at home had Nick Clegg looking at them, and they believed him. They believed what he said. And it was a huge social experiment. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't even true what he said, but it didn't matter. He looked at people. And that remains the case in all the psychology assessments and all of the research that's been done, and you can see it in court when witnesses give evidence. If you look at the jury, look at the judge, it's very, very hard for them to think, you're lying to me. But if you don't look at someone, it's not as easy for them to buy into what you're saying. So you've got to make sure that you're looking and you're making eye contact. You can't do it all the time. You've got to look down at your notes and look up occasionally. But most of the time, you should be looking at who you're talking to. It is very persuasive. Some things that you should not do. You should not rush. So you will know from tonight, and it'll be repeated very regularly, you have 8 minutes in which to conduct this assessment. For those of you who may have some extra time, that can go up a little bit, but broadly speaking, it's 8 minutes, and this is a good reason to have another couple of minutes. So when you are at home preparing, you need to carry out the piece of advocacy that you want to deliver regularly at home, and make sure that you're falling within that 8 minutes. If you end up doing it in 8 minutes and 30 seconds, it is not fail. There's some scope, there's some leeway. But that's what you should be aiming for, around about 8 minutes. And if you're around about 8 minutes, you're probably saying enough. If you're finishing in 6 minutes or 4 minutes, you're probably not saying enough, okay? So speaking at a normal speed, it should be taking you about 8 minutes. If you rush too much, what happens is your listener, the judge, cannot listen to what you just said, process it in their brain, apply it to the case facts and think, is that right or is that wrong? Do I agree? Do I disagree? Anything I want to ask? Because you've moved on to your next sentence and your next sentence and your next sentence, and it's kind of almost like a tyranny of the judge. I can't keep up with you, you're going too fast. And you might be saying really good, important things, but if the judge can't hear them, process them in his or her mind, and decide whether they agree and think it's a good point, then you're losing valuable, if you like, marks. So make sure you speak at a speed that the judge can understand what you're saying. And I'm not talking about accent, I'm not talking about anything other than speed, okay? And if you want to see how to do this properly, how to communicate well, when you go home tonight, turn on your television and watch whatever it might be, Strictly Come Dancing, The News, British Bake Off, any of those people. It looks really easy, doesn't it? They're at the top of their profession. They are professional communicators. When was the last time you were watching one of those really big shows on television and you thought, I don't know what she's saying, what is she saying? You can always understand them. If English is your second or third language, you can probably understand them because they're speaking at speed and with a cadence that you can get and grasp immediately. And it's not an accident. They're doing it on purpose so that we can all understand them. So you can look at that and think, that's kind of what I need to do when I'm in court, so the judge can understand what's happening next, what am I talking about now. So don't be too precious or pompous about it. Look at TV presenters and see how they do it and think, that's the sort of speed that I would want to be talking at when I'm doing my assessment. I've got 8 minutes in which to talk, so I'll give myself a rough idea how much I can say in that 8 minutes. Okay? Don't read from a script. As we said already, everyone here can read. You're all on a postgraduate course. That's a given. What we're looking for is more than reading. You can have notes, look down for a reminder. Oh yeah, bail conditions, look up, and then you need to talk. That is important, okay? Because if you write out a script, you can feel comfort from that and think, if I just read this out, I'll be fine. You might not be, okay? You do need to be able to speak without complete script in front of you. Don't mumble. So, for example, some people will choose to use a particular word or phrase that they've not used before, and they'll stumble over it. Okay. My partner and my kids are absolutely convinced that I'm dyslexic, so I will struggle with words and I will struggle with medical conditions or particularly complicated surnames or whatever I really struggle with. But I don't get caught by it ever in court because I've thought of it in advance, and either I've practiced how to say that word or I found a particularly ingenious way to go around it. But I don't stand up and suddenly think, oh, I don't know how to pronounce that. Because that would be really silly to go all the way to court and think, how do I say that? How have you not said it before when you're practicing? So if there are words or names or phrases that you choose to use or you have to use, practice them in advance so you have some confidence about them. Because there may be references to medical conditions or places or people that you're not familiar with, doesn't fit in with the words you would normally use. Either practice it or find another way to express it so you then can relax and you're not worried about it. Okay? Don't try and use particularly posh or long or Latin words. You don't need to do that. As we said right at the very beginning, it's about communication. Keep it simple and basic and make sure that both the judge and, if there was someone in the courtroom, a client or a member of the public, can understand what you're saying. If you try and make it too complicated, you can often get yourself into trouble. So keep it simple. However, no slang or colloquial phrases, so keep it simple, basic English. If you've heard words or phrases that you would use at home or you would use with your friends, that might be absolutely fine there. Nothing wrong with that, but you wouldn't bring it into the courtroom. So the general rule of thumb is that if somebody from Newcastle or Glasgow or Cornwall came to hear you in court, they would recognise all the terms you use. They wouldn't look at you and think, that must be something they say in London, because I don't recognise that word. Okay? It's basic, simple language. Okay? Just like you hear, like I say, on most mainstream television channels all of the time. So if it's a phrase that you're only hearing locally amongst your friends and amongst your peers, it may not be a phrase to use. Okay? And the reverse of ending on a positive point is don't end on a weak point. It's a criminal case, so by definition, there is something bad going on or we wouldn't be here. If you have to talk about a particular negative point, and you probably do, get it out of the way at an earlier stage. Don't leave it till the very last minute when the judge is going to have it ringing in his or her ears when they go away to decide your client's particular fate. Okay? Now a little bit on ethics and advocacy, and then I can leave you in peace. Keep it simple in terms of ethics, and I'm not going to take you through the rules and regulations, they will be there. But keep in mind that if a judge has asked for you to tell him or her a fact from your experience of the case, when did this arrive in your particular email box, or have you spoken to the client's family, if you're going to say something, the judge is taking it as a fact that what you're saying is truthful. So ethically, if you fall foul of that, it is very, very serious, because the whole system is based on the fact that the judge can trust what you say as a matter of fact, hasn't got to go and check it like they would do if it was a defendant, where they say, well, I can't take his word for it, it has to be checked. If you say it's true, the judge will assume that is correct. We'll have a small talk then about our next small group session. We're going to begin the process of looking at criminal law through advocacy. A chap called Carlos Gires, he's charged with aggravated vehicle taking, and during the course of the class, one of the things we'll talk about is applying for bail. So Carlos has been to a police station, not been released, taken to court the next day, and your job will be to apply for bail for him. And I want you to make sure that you're familiar with what is bail, you're familiar with the term, and in what circumstances might bail be denied. There are some cases that won't apply to Carlos, so you do need to think about people outside of his particular situation, but broadly, what circumstances can bail be refused. As we looked at this before, I'll just go through this very quickly. In terms of Carlos, you'll have the case papers. Make sure that you identify the relevant issues. What does he say is true? What does he say is untrue? Look at the substantive law in this particular case. Remember, vehicle taking, Section 12A of the Theft Act. Look at the procedural law, the Bail Act, and think about an advocacy plan. So you know what you want to say and when you want to say it. If they're not there already, they will be soon. Yes, yeah, absolutely. In terms of your advocacy plan, some of the things there we've mentioned already, substantive law, procedural law, issues between the parties, but think also about what's the strength of your case and the weakness of your case when applying for bail, and what's your goal. Your goal probably should be to have him released on bail with no conditions. But if the judge says, for example, I'm worried if he goes back into Peckham or the London Borough of Southwark, he will start to steal cars again. I made up the Peckham bit, I don't know where it's from. You can then have a fallback position to say, well, perhaps because he lives in Hertfordshire, he should have a better position not to go within the London Borough of Southwark, because you can measure Southwark. Southwark has a border. It ends somewhere and it starts somewhere. So your fallback position could be not to go into the London Borough of Southwark, or whatever it happens to be if these offences were committed, allegedly. Okay? Now, in terms of content and structure, your criteria is how much you take account of the nature and seriousness of the crime, how you can pick up biographical details, organise your facts and argument effectively, and suggest a bail package and sentence consistent with the crime, the offender, and the legal practice. So to give you an idea, if someone is accused of nighttime burglaries and they have a long history of nighttime burglaries, if you suggest, for example, that they shouldn't go into the London Borough of Southwark, that's probably not going to really address nighttime burglaries. What you might want to suggest is a curfew condition where they have to be at home by 8 o'clock when it gets dark. That then deals with their nighttime burglary. But if they're stealing cars in Southwark, having them at home at nighttime may not help, because you can steal a car, I'm told, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So then you want to keep them out of Southwark. So look at your, if anyone lives in Southwark, I'm sorry, I'm not picking myself. It's about your particular case. Look at what's happening in your case and suggest something that will be helpful in that case, not just a machine gun approach of all of the bail conditions you can think of. And you are marked on that. The more relevant your conditions, the better. Okay? And then other criteria, your performance and your actual ability to deliver this persuasively and to keep within that time limit should you end up being someone who's got the 8 minutes. If you're given more, then obviously the assessment is based on the more the longer period. Advocacy and practice assessment, your formative assessment will be in room 403 when you are invited to come at a particular time, when you are doing your mock exam, and your final exam then will be in January 2026. You don't have to, but you might find it helpful to come to the final assessment, particularly maybe even the mock, dressed as smartly as you can, because it gives you a certain confidence, makes you feel like you're actually a lawyer, okay? If you can't do that for all sorts of reasons, it's not a big issue, but it makes you feel confident, and it makes you seem like you are well on the way to being a lawyer. So think about what you will wear as well as everything else. To be competent, this is ultimately what we expect you to do. Formulate and deliver a coherent submission in a structured, concise and persuasive manner, and in doing so demonstrate an understanding of the ethics, the etiquette and the conventions of advocacy, okay? So when you get your papers, fact papers, whether it's Carlos for this first class, whether it's your mock, whether it's the actual assessment, make sure that you have spent the time to learn those facts and research the law, that you've spent the time watching yourself back in a video, in footage with friends, and people are pointing out to you what you're doing well, so you keep doing that, because you might do something really well. If no one tells you, you might stop doing it. So you need to know what you're doing well, what you're doing not so well, iron out the things you're not doing so well, think about what would I ask if I was the judge, and you will go into that assessment well prepared. We would expect you to have at your fingertips the facts of the case, within reason, okay? So you'll need to know the facts, know the law, expect questions, and then in those circumstances, having done that before you walk into the room, however confident or nervous you feel, I would say to you that you will get through that assessment. Okay? And some people almost look forward to this assessment, and some people dread it and can't sleep the night before. But if you have prepared well, thought about the issues, my experience of students coming to the assessment is you'll get through it fine. You might not enjoy it, it's a different thing, but you'll get through it as long as you've done the work. If you haven't done the work, even if you're really good and quick thinking, it's very hard because you don't know the facts of the case. Okay? That's everything I wanted to say to you, finishing almost on time. Does anybody have any questions or observations? Yes? And the final assessment is in January next year. The exact date I haven't got to hand, but that'll be decided probably nearer time. Oh, I think that's going to be in October, November. You get lots of notes. You'll have your case papers at least a week in advance, probably more. Yeah. Okay? Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Enjoy it.